This is the Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 5th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue named Jairus came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and begged him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." So he went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she said, "If I but touch his clothes, I will be made well." Immediately her hemorrhage stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" He looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" But he overheard what they said. Jesus said to the leader of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, John, the brother of James. When they came to the house of the leader of the synagogue, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. Then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. He took her by the hand and said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl got up and began to walk about. She was about 12 years of age. At this they were overcome with amazement. He strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. The Gospel of the Lord. So for many of us, the miracles of Jesus are among the most memorable things that Jesus does. Theologically, we may decide and know that Jesus' death for our sins is more important than the miracles. And we might agree that the things Jesus taught are really more important than whether Jesus could turn water into wine. But the miracles, they're just really cool, and so we remember them. And often, the miracles captivate our attention. And it's not really surprising why. Miracles captivate our attention because they're stories with wonderful, happy endings. And in our daily lives, we are so often inundated with stories that end tragically, like the wall-to-wall coverage of the building in Florida that collapsed on all of those people. Our lives are full of stories of oppression and injustice, and with stories that leave you wondering when the next shoe is going to drop. A story where things come out better than you expected is a great change, and so we love the miracle stories. Miracles captivate our attention because they also speak to our deepest needs and desires for God to intervene in our lives in the intractable problems that just seem to defy any kind of solution. You know, the times and the situations where there doesn't seem to be a good way out of whatever it is that we're dealing with. You know, we think, if God could do a miracle back then, might it happen for me? And even if I know it's unlikely, the thought of that possibility can really crowd out everything else. And miracles captivate our attention because miracles seem like the kinds of things that can bring about and strengthen faith. After all, we ask, don't these stories prove that Jesus is who he says he is? Don't they prove that God is present? Wouldn't they be the kinds of things that would help others come to believe in God's love and God's mercy? And so it is particularly strange when Jesus, after performing a miracle, specifically commands people not to tell anybody about the miracles they've just experienced. And when Jesus does this, it's not just one of those, oh, it's not a big deal. You don't have to tell anybody about this. Don't worry, that's it, blah, blah, blah. He's really, really serious about this. It says, Mark says, he strictly ordered them that nobody should know about this. Jesus does this over and over again in Mark's gospel. Why? I mean, it doesn't seem like it's a terribly good marketing strategy. You would think Jesus would want people to know what he's capable of doing. It also doesn't seem like it's even possible. How would anybody be able to keep quiet about this stuff? I mean, after all, we have heard about these stories because people did not keep quiet about them. And commanding people to be quiet about miracles does not seem to be a good way to draw people to faith. Except that in both of these stories today, faith does not come from the miracles. Faith precedes the miracles. Faith is finally about trust and confidence in God's love and God's willingness to help. And both Jairus and this unnamed woman are confident of Jesus' power before they ever meet him. Both are certain that Jesus will be willing to help them even before they experience his help, and both are convinced that Jesus can do what no one else can, even though they have no idea exactly how Jesus will help them. And the irony of the miracles is that at the end of these two stories, the only people who are commended for their faith are these two who had faith before the miracles. Not a single person who sees these miracles comes away and says, wow, now I believe. And maybe this is why Jesus is not so up on having people focus on the miracles. Lots of people saw miracles, but only saw neat tricks. But what Jesus is after is actual faith. Trust in God's love, God's presence, and God's help, even if no miracles are attached. That kind of faith is perhaps best expressed by the opening lines of today's first reading from Lamentations. The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases, his mercies never come to an end. And it's important to remember that these words were not written by somebody celebrating a great miracle that had just occurred in his life. They were written by a prophet who was sitting in a destroyed city, the ruined city of Jerusalem, where everybody thought all was lost and where nobody had hope. And yet, even in the midst of this, with no sign of hope right now, the prophet can say, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. Faith is knowing that God's steadfast love and mercy are always present, even when things seem hopeless and even when miracles are not expected. That was the faith that both Jairus and the woman had before they ever experienced a miracle. And Jesus wants us to have faith in God's love, mercy, and presence, not faith in miracles. And so Jesus never promises miracles, but he does promise that God's love and mercy are going to be there for us apart from any kind of worthiness on our part. You know, one of the things that we should notice from these miracle stories is that we know virtually nothing at all, actually nothing at all, about the goodness of either Jairus or the woman. They may have been nice, wonderful, upstanding people, or not. Doesn't matter. They ask for and expect God's help without any merit on their part. You know, and sometimes people get caught up, especially when they're hoping for miracles, they get caught up in whether they have been worthy enough. Not have I done enough good things, but have I prayed hard enough? Have I believed enough? Have I gotten enough people to join my prayer chain so that sometimes people think that somehow prayer is like a petition before the government. If you get enough people to sign on to it, God will grant your request. So if you don't get that, you haven't worked hard enough for it. But that's not ever the way it works. We start to think that somehow God's goodness is connected to something we've done or not done, instead of something that God does. And God's goodness, God's mercy, is always a function of who God is, never a function of who we are. So Jesus does not promise us miracles, but he does promise us that God's mercy may come in an unexpected form, even when we think our situation is beyond help. Jairus hoped for healing. He probably thought his daughter was beyond help when his friends came and said, "Your daughter is dead, why bother him any further?" But he was open to continuing the journey with Jesus. He was open to continue to see what it was Jesus had in mind, even though, truly, he had no idea that Jesus was going to go in and raise his daughter from the dead. Nobody had seen this ever before. And part of the key, anyway, to our experiencing God's mercy in our lives is not giving up on the journey with Jesus, even when things do not work out the way we had hoped, or God's mercy ends up showing up in a way we had not expected, or frankly, God, it would have been nicer if I hadn't had to go through this trauma first before I got to the mercy. But sometimes, that's the way God works. And Jesus does not promise us miracles, but he does assure us that faith is not about how hard we believe, but about our openness to trust God to act, even and especially when we don't know what that action is going to be. Miraculous healing and being raised from the dead are great things, but often God's mercy in our lives comes in the form of the strength to get through a horrible situation that we never imagined we would be able to live through, or in the form of help from a friend or our community of faith, or in the sense of peace that we get in the midst of pain and illness that just seems to go on forever. Jesus does not promise us miracles, which is probably part of the reason he didn't want people talking too much about them. But Jesus does promise us and show us that God's love is always present for us, even when it's not apparent to the world. Jesus does promise us and show us that God's mercies are always being given to us, even if those mercies don't show up in visible and miraculous ways. And Jesus does promise us and show us that even when things in our lives don't work out as we would have liked them to, God never abandons his journey with us.